This video is for Module 2, Ethics and Regulation, Chapter 3, Regulation, in the CFA Institute Investment Foundations program. Just a quick review. Module 2 is Ethics and Regulation. It's made up of two chapters. Chapter 2, Ethics and Investment Professionalism, and Chapter 3, Regulation, which is the topic for this video today. Weight on the exam, 10%. That translates into 12 exam questions, because there's 120 exams questions on the 2-hour exam. The estimated time to study this module is 10 hours, and there's 91 practice questions in the learning ecosystem. There's 49 questions for Chapter 2, and there are 42 questions for Chapter 3 on regulation. That's where you're going to spend quite a bit of your time doing the practice questions. There are 7 learning outcome statements for this chapter. After completing this chapter, you should be able to do the following. A, define regulations. B, describe objectives of regulation. C, describe potential consequences of regulatory failure. D, describe a regulatory process and the importance of each step in the process. E, identify specific types of regulation and describe the reasons for each. F, describe elements of a company's policies and procedures to ensure the company complies with regulation. And finally, G, describe potential consequences of compliance failure. Before we jump into the learning outcome statements, I just wanted to show another quick study tip in the CFA Institute Investment Foundations program learning ecosystem. So again, here I am on the lessons, Ethics and Regulation, Module 2. And Chapter 3 is regulation, so we can click on it. There's the learning outcome statements, as you know, and then we can click through and read the ebook. When we're finished reading through, we're going to do our practice problems. So if I scroll down here to regulation, you can see that I've answered 26 of 42 questions. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to resume my practice. So one of the things that I wanted to show you here is that review answer. There's a functionality here on and off. When it's on, you're going to review each question as you click confirm. When it's off, you're going to answer a number of questions in a series, and then you can go back and do your review. So for example, if I leave it on to start with, which of the following is a consequence of market information asymmetries in financial markets? A, strong economic growth. B, fair and orderly markets. C, investors are deterred from investing. I'm going to try B, asymmetrical. No, wait a minute. I'm going to try C. Asymmetrical information means that only one side of the party has the information, the other doesn't. It means that investors may be deterred from investing. So it says here, information asymmetries is differences in available information can deter investors from investing. And it tells you why it's right. So if I turn that off, and I'm going to continue, so I've got this turned off now, you can see that I can do 2 questions in a row without reviewing it. I'd want to do that when I'm trying to recreate some exam conditions, because you can see here it's timing me on this question, 120 questions on the exam, 120 minutes, it's 1 minute per exam. It's nice to do a bunch of practice questions in a row to get some insight on how your timing is, because some questions are going to be longer than others, and that's fine, and there's no penalties for getting a wrong answer. So you want to make sure that you answer all the questions on the exam. So let's just do 2 in a row here. It's often difficult to convict a portfolio manager for manipulating share prices because it's difficult to prove or determine A, profits made as a result of the manipulation, B, intent on the part of the market manipulator, or C, ownership of the assets used to manipulate. I would say perhaps B would be the correct answer. I'm not reviewing it now. I'm just, because I have the review answer off, I'm going to go to the next question, and I can answer. You can see 8 seconds on this one. I can click through a number of questions. When a regulator wants to clarify a new regulation for the benefit of market players, it may publish A, staff interpretations, B, additional regulations, or C, a report showing market acceptance. So want to clarify a new regulation. Well, they might, perhaps they would may publish additional regulations, which would help to clarify. Anyhow, confirm, you can see moving on. to the next question because I've got the review answer functionality off. Alternate dispute resolution process involves a regulator, often uses the expertise of a court of law. B, an ombudsman. C, another regulator. Well, I'll try B, confirm it, and I'm done practicing. And so now when it's done, you can see it's going to bring me my review, and you can see that I've got the last question I got right, but the one before that I got wrong, so I can click on the review. Oh, A was correct. It may publish staff interpretations. So C is incorrect. Evidence of market acceptance would not help to clarify new regulation. B is incorrect. Regulators would not typically introduce other regulations to clarify one. They would do staff interpretations. So you can see here I'm doing my review after I've gone through a series of questions. Okay, so again, that functionality is in there. When you're doing your practice, you're going to review the answer immediately after doing the question, or turn it off and do a series of questions and go back and do your review. Okay? Learning outcome statement A is define regulations. Regulations are rules that set standards for conduct and that carry the force of the law. They are set and enforced by government bodies and by other entities authorized by government bodies. This enforcement aspect is a critical difference between ethical principles and professional standards. Violation of ethical principles and professional standards have consequences, but these consequences may not be as severe as those for violations of laws and regulations. Laws and regulations can be used to reinforce ethical principles and professional standards. Learning outcome statement B is describe the objectives of regulation. So there's 6 objectives that we're going to see on these next 2 slides, and this is a classic example of having a list that you kind of want to memorize and some of the key words under each of the objectives. Anyhow, let's go through the objectives of regulation. Number 1, protect consumers. Regulators protect consumers from abusive and manipulative practices, including fraud in the market. Second objective of regulation is foster capital formation and economic growth. Regulators seek to ensure healthy financial markets in order to foster overall economic development and reduce risk in financial markets. Third objective, support economic stability. Regulators seek to ensure that financial firms, both individually and as an industry, do not engage in practices that could disrupt the economy. Number 4, ensure fairness. Regulators seek to maintain fair and orderly markets in which no participant has an unfair advantage. Number 5, enhance efficiency. Regulations that standardize documentation or how to transmit information can enhance economic efficiency by reducing duplication and confusion. And finally, the 6th objective of regulation is to improve society. Regulations may be used to achieve societal objectives, such as increasing the availability of credit to a specific group, encouraging home ownership, increasing national savings rates, and helping to prevent money laundering. So again, 6 objectives, a bit of a list there. You want to make your list on a flashcard and pick up on some of the key words for each of the objectives. Learning outcome statement C is describe potential consequences of regulatory failure. So inadequate regulation and failure to enforce regulation can have a variety of consequences, including failing to meet the previous objectives. So there's 3 bullet points here. The first one is the results of a regulatory breakdown can harm customers and counterparties, as well as damage trust in the financial services industry, which includes the investment industry. Second main point, customers may lose their life savings when sold unsuitable products, or customers could be harmed if an investment firm misuses customers' assets. And the final bullet point for this slide is, furthermore, the failure of one large company in the financial services industry can lead to a catastrophic chain reaction, a contagion that results in the failure of many other companies, causing serious damage to the economy. So you can see this is a little bit of overlap to Chapter 2. If you've gone through Chapter 2, it talked about the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, which is relates to bullet number 2, customers lost their life savings through fraud. There was misusing the customer's assets. They were taking in new money to pay investment returns to previous clients, and that's what a Ponzi scheme is. And there was also the example from 2008 financial crisis with the insurance companies and the banks that needed to be bailed out. It was the starting of a contagion. Okay, so you can see that chapters 2 and 3 do relate to each other. Consequences of regulatory failure. First is breakdown of damage of trust, customers losing savings, and potential financial contagions. Learning outcome statement D is describe a regulatory process and the importance of each step in the process. So there's a 10-step process here. Again, it's another list. You're going to want to remember the correct ordering of the steps and some type of perhaps mnemonic to like perceived need, PN, legal authority, LA, 3 analysis, some type of memory tool. I like to make my flashcards, as you know, and then a couple of keywords for each of the steps. Anyhow, 10 steps over the next 4 slides. Let's go through this fairly quickly. The first step is the perceived need. And that can come from many directions, political pressure or forces within the industry, and may be developed proactively or reactively. The second step in a regulatory process would be the legal authority. Sometimes more than one regulator has authority and responds to the same perceived need. Step number 3, analysis, should consider all of the different regulatory approaches that can be used to achieve the desired outcome and weigh their cost and benefits. So it's basically cost and benefit. That's the keywords that I see in the analysis. There's a cost-benefit analysis to regulation because there's often increased costs when you increase regulation. Okay, so that's the keywords for step number 3. Clicking on to step number 4, public consultation, gives those likely to be affected by the regulations the opportunity to make suggestions and comments. Step 5 is adoption. The rule is adopted and may be clarified with the publication of guidelines, frequently asked questions, etc. And we saw that from the practice problems. If there's clarification needed, there's guidelines or statement papers, not necessarily new regulations. Okay. Number 6 is implementation. Some regulations take force immediately and some are phased in over time. Firms need to monitor and learn about any changes. Step number 7 is the monitoring activities. Monitoring activities include routine examinations of firms, investigations of complaints, and routine or special monitoring of individual activities. Step number 8 is enforcement. Punishments include cease and desist orders and monetary fines, fees, or settlements, and may also involve the loss of licenses, a ban from the industry, and or prison terms. So that's the important thing to understand about laws, is that if you break the law, punishments can include up to and leading to prison. Okay. Step number 9, dispute resolution, is a fair, fast, and efficient dispute resolution system. Can improve the market's reputation for integrity and promote efficiency. And finally, step number 10 in the typical regulatory process is review. Rules can become obsolete as technology and the industry change. A good regulatory system has procedures in place for regularly reviewing rules to determine their effectiveness and whether any changes are necessary. So after looking at the 10 steps of that typical regulatory process and the importance of each step, what we're looking at now is a classification of regulatory regimes. And so you can see here there's 4 broad-based classifications and the opportunity for a little bit of a hybrid as well. So there's principle-based regulatory regimes, rules-based regulatory regimes, merit-based regulatory regimes, and finally disclosure-based regulatory regimes. So you need to understand a little bit of the differences between these classifications, okay? So principle-based systems set up broad principles within which the industry is expected to operate. Regulators avoid establishing detailed rules, both to avoid legal complexity and to provide flexibility to the regulators in interpreting and the industry in complying. Rules-based systems offer clarity and legal certainty to industry participants. However, real-world regulatory environments are usually hybrids of these two types. So there'll be some type of hybrid between principles and the rules, okay? So U.S. regulation is often described as rules-based, yet it includes no specific statutory definition of insider trading. Prosecutions are made under the broad anti-fraud provisions of U.S. law that outlaw any type of fraud or manipulation. UK regulation, on the other hand, is often described as principle-based, yet some regulations, such as the rules for credit unions, are very detailed. So you can see that there's a combination of principles and rules. It's a little bit of a hybrid in both the US and the UK. Merit-based regulation attempts to protect investors by limiting the products sold to them. So that's the key words there. Merit-based, protect investors, limiting the products, okay? For example, investing in hedge funds is usually restricted to investors that have a certain level of resources and or expertise. Disclosure-based regulation seeks to determine not whether the investment will be good or bad for investors, but only whether all material information is disclosed to the investor. This regulation assumes that properly informed investors can make their own determinations regarding whether the potential return of investment is worth the risk. Once again, the real world is actually a hybrid. Although U.S. regulation is mostly based on disclosure, U.S. regulators sometimes impose extra burdens of disclosure on and restrict access to products that they think lack merit or are highly risky or are poorly understood. Learning Outcome Statement E is identify specific types of regulation and describe the reasons for each. So this is a big learning outcome statement. There's 8 slides for it, and there's quite a bit of content in the text. So we'll jump into it. In order for markets to function properly, market participants require information about companies and governments raising funds, the specific financial instruments being sold and traded, and finally the markets for those instruments. So if we look first at corporate issuers, regulators typically require corporate issuers of securities to disclose detailed information to potential buyers before offering the securities. So the disclosures generally include audited financial statements, general business information, use of proceeds, information about management, and discussion of important risk factors. Moving on to market transparency rules, information about what other investors are willing to pay for a security or the price they just paid is valuable to investors because it contains information about what other investors believe a security is worth. But investors generally do not want to reveal their own private information. Moving on to disclosure triggers, stock exchanges and market regulators typically have a range of disclosures which may be required as soon as a trigger event occurs or a threshold is reached. For holdings in a particular stock, there can be, for example, significant shareholder disclosures designed to inform the market of potential takeover activity, directors' dealings in shares of the company, or short positions. This slide is looking at types of sales practice rules, and some consumers seeking financial advice find it difficult to assess the quality advice they are receiving. These consumers may be vulnerable to abusive sales practice by sellers who are more concerned about their own profit than the customer's best interests. So therefore, there's sometimes regulations with regards to sales practices and rules. The first thing looking at is advertising. Regulators may control the form and content of advertising to ensure that it's not misleading. Regulators often disapprove of such promises as guaranteed returns and sure-win situations. Providers of financial services may be tempted to exaggerate past performance by displaying only certain winning time periods or certain winning accounts. Regulators seek to counteract this tendency by creating standards for the reporting of past performance. Okay? Moving on to fees, regulators may impose price controls to limit the commissions that can be charged on the sale of various financial products, as well as to limit the markups and markdowns that occur when investment firms trade securities with their customers out of their own inventories. Next is information barriers. Many large firms in the investment industry offer investment banking services to corporate issuers and at the same time publish investment research and provide financial advice, which can create a potential conflict of interest. Firms may publish biased investment advice in order to win more lucrative investment banking business. Similarly, research analysts may be under pressure to publish favorable research reports on securities in which the firm has large positions in its own inventory. Regulators attempt to resolve these conflicts by requiring firms to create barriers, virtual and physical, between investment banking and research. With regards to suitability standards, that is regulations that are designed to hold those in the investment industry accountable for the advice that they give to their clients. Any advice or recommendation should be suitable for the client, consistent with the client's interests. Some participants in the investment industry are held to an even higher standard, frequently called a fiduciary standard. Under this standard, any advice or recommendation must be both suitable for the client and in the client's best interests. In order to advise or make recommendations, it's critical to know your customer, KYC, gather information about the client's circumstances, needs, and attitudes towards risks. And finally, restrictions on self-dealing. Many investment firms in the investment industry sell financial products such as securities directly to investors out of their own inventories. This practice allows them to provide faster service and better liquidity to their customers, as well as to provide access to proprietary financial products that may not be available elsewhere. However, self-dealing potentially creates a conflict of interest because the firm's interests may differ from those of the customer. Now we're moving on to section 5.5 of the text, and we're looking at trading rules. So regulations are often designed to set investment industry standards as well as to prevent abusive trading practices. So the next two slides, we're going to look at 5 types of rules, trading rules, and the first one is market standards. Government regulation can be used to set, for example, the standard length of time between a trade and the settlement of the trade, which is typically 3 business days for equities in most global markets. Moving on to market manipulation. Market manipulation involves taking actions intended to move the price of a stock or any security in order to generate a short-term profit. Insider trading. A market in which some participants have an unfair advantage over other participants lacks legitimacy and thus deters investors. For this reasons, most jurisdictions have rules designed to prevent insider trading. Because material non-public information flows through companies in the financial services industry about the financial condition of their clients and their trading, regulators often expect companies to have policies and procedures in place to restrict access to such information and to deter parties with access from trading on this information. Moving on now to front running. Front running is the act of placing an order ahead of a customer's order to take advantage of the price impact that the customer's orders will have. For example, if you know a customer is ordering a large quantity that is likely to drive up the price, you could take advantage of it by buying in advance of the customer's order. And finally, brokerage practices. In some countries, investment managers may use arrangements in which brokerage commissions are used to pay for external research. This is called soft money or soft dollar arrangements. Rather than paying cash for the research, the broker directs transactions to a provider, which gives the brokerage firm access to the research produced by the provider. And regulators may have rules regarding the use of such arrangements because clients' transactions could be directed to gain access to the research rather than being used in the client's best interests. So finally, the last slide for this learning outcome statement is on other types of regulation. So I encourage you to go into the text and follow up on it. So I'll just be a little bit brief. In some markets, there's regulations with regards to proxy voting rules. And in some countries, brokers are required to distribute voting materials to their customers, gather voting instructions, and submit them for inclusion in the counting of votes, typically at an annual meeting. In other countries, corporate issuers distribute materials directly to the shareholders. There are regulations with regards to anti-money laundering rules. Companies in the financial services industries can be used by criminals to launder money, to facilitate tax evasion, and potentially to fund terrorism. Governments naturally want to deter such activities, and they use their regulatory power over companies in the financial services industry to do so. Regulations may require companies to confirm and record the identity of their clients, to report payments, such as dividends, to tax authorities, and to report various activities, such as large cash transactions. And finally, other types of regulations with regards to business continuity planning rules. Given the essential nature of financial services to the economy, regulators may also be concerned about business continuity in the event of disasters such as fires, floods, earthquakes, epidemics. And so regulators want to be assured that customers' records are adequately backed up and that the firm has plans in place to recover from a disaster. Learning Outcome Statement F is describe elements of a company's policies and procedures to ensure the company complies with regulations. So the next 4 slides are with regards to this Learning Outcome Statement. Companies within the investment industry, like all companies, are expected to have policies and procedures, also referred to as corporate policies and procedures, in place to ensure employees' compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So policies are principles of action adopted by a company, and procedures are what the company must do to achieve a desired outcome. Policies and procedures also guide employees with matters outside the scope of regulation. Now we're looking at company policies and procedures with regards to supervision within companies. So there's 3 categories here: hiring and training, continuing education, and documentation. So just as important for regulators to supervise companies in the investment industry, it's also vital that companies supervise their employees. With large amounts of money at stake, a single rogue employee can cause significant harm or even bring down a company. Regulators are likely to take action not only against the rogue trader, but also against his or her supervisors and managers on the grounds that supervisors and managers should have put policies, procedures, and internal controls in place and to detect the unauthorized activity. So with regards to hiring and training, supervision starts even before a new employee joins the company. We can see a practice question in the QBank about that. So supervision, that's a key thing. Supervision starts before a new employee joins the company. The company should conduct appropriate background checks to make sure that the prospective employee is competent and of good character. The employee's initial orientation and training should emphasize the vital importance of compliance with corporate policies and procedures and with relevant regulations. As we move on to continuing education, it's important to provide continuing education to reinforce the mission-critical nature of compliance with corporate policies and procedures and with relevant regulations. It is also important to have documented systems in place to ensure that employees follow the company's compliance procedures. Documentation. A company must be able to prove to regulators that it has established good corporate policies and procedures and that they're being followed. So good documentation, such as keeping records of employees' continuing education, is essential to improve compliance and enforcement. The next area of company policies and procedures is with regards to compensation plans. And the main point here that you can see is that bonuses can affect behavior. Bonuses for reaching target sales levels may motivate employees to make more sales, but they can also motivate employees to break rules and engage in deception in order to make those sales. This next slide is looking at procedures for handling violations. So no matter how honest and well-meaning employees are, sooner or later there will be some rule violations. So a culture of cover-ups is dangerous for a financial firm because once employees discover that it's possible to hide problems, they will be tempted to take advantage of that. So companies need to have procedures in place for employees to report problems without fear of retribution, and that would be anonymous reporting, for example, as well as procedures for remediating problems in an effective manner. So you can see here, violation, there's reporting and there's remediation. And the key point with regards to reporting is that there should be some anonymous mechanism in place for employees to report problems without fear of any type of retribution. So now we're down to the last learning outcome statement for this chapter. Learning outcome statement G is describe potential consequences of compliance failure. So failure to comply with regulations and policies and procedures can have significant consequences for employees, managers, customers, the company, the investment industry, and even the economy. When a regulatory action occurs, even if no formal charges are brought, the legal costs to individuals and firms involved in dealing with it can be high. Sanctions for individuals may include fines, imprisonment, loss of license, and a lifetime ban from the investment industry. When subordinates violate rules, managers may also face consequences for failure to supervise. Companies can also face sanctions, including fines, loss of licenses, and forced closure. Compliance failures affect more than just the company and its employees. Customers and counterparties can be harmed, and trust in the investment industry and financial markets damaged. Customers may lose their life savings, and counterparties may suffer losses. At the extreme, the failure of one large company in the financial services industry can lead to a catastrophic chain reaction, a contagion that results in the failure of many other companies, causing serious damage in the economy. So that's the last learning outcome statement and the last slide. So in summary from the chapter, if every individual and every company acted ethically, the need for regulation would be greatly reduced. But the need would not disappear altogether, because regulation does not just seek to prevent undesirable behavior, but also to establish rules that can guide standards that can be widely adopted within the investment industry. And the evidence of a recognized and accepted standards is important to market participants, so trust in the investment industry depends in no small measure on effective regulation. And that is the conclusion for this video on Module 2 of the CFA Investment Institute Investment Foundations Program, Chapter 3 on Regulation. Thank you.